science fiction and fantasy author, and I'm here back with my next, with actually my last program of From Pen to Paper. Tonight we will be talking about sci-fi and fantasy, and we're just finishing up last week of the science fiction lesson that we're talking about, and this week we're going to be finishing that up, and we'll be talking about fantasy. So let's get right into it. Basically, I'll reiterate on the story construction. That's where we left off. And in science fiction and in fantasy, there's some similarities and some differences. And in this one, in the story construction, we like to talk about who hurts the most in the story, who's the main character and suffering, the pain, and is driving, which drives him to the outcome of the story. And we also talked about who has the freedom and power to act, someone who can see through the struggle. That would be either the main character or one of his friends that helps him through the struggle. And you want your sympathy to be drawn toward the main character. And then there's the viewpoint character, the one telling the story. And that would be the narrator or whoever else is viewpoint the story is from. Okay, with that being said, there's a thing that we use in science fiction that is called the Mice quotient. And this also applies to fantasy as well. And the first one's the MALU. It's an acronym. And the first one is MALU, which is all the elements that came up during the world creation phase. So anything that had to do with the world creation would be your MALU, kind of like your settings and your descriptions of the settings. Okay, and then there's the idea, which is the I, the new bits of information that are discovered in the process of the story by the characters who didn't previously know that information. The story starts with raising a question and ends with questions answered. So at the beginning of the story, the characters will have a question about what they're going to do, and the answers will be given to them as they go through the story. Okay? And then there's the character, which is the transformation that takes place within the main character during the course of the story. So this is the change, that the transformation that goes on. Okay, and then there's the event, which is the problem in the universe or the planet or the world that needs to be solved. Okay, and this can be it could be something as simple as retrieving something that was lost, or it could be a war. It could be whatever you want it to be, whatever the problem is that needs to be solved. Okay, and then another process in science fiction, especially, is called exposition, exploration, and execution. And what that is the exposition is the explanation of the story or the idea. Exploration is expanding on the idea or story, and execution is actually writing the story. Okay? And that's what that means. And okay, and so now we're going to start talking a little bit about fantasy. And like science fiction, there are subdivisions of fantasy. I'm not going to give you all of them, but I will tell you a few. There's like traditional fantasy, which is like the Lord of the Rings and Narnia and stuff like that. And then there's the urban fantasy, which is in the city, kind of like what do they call them? Urban legends, kind of like that type of stuff. And then there's science fiction fantasy, of course, which is like Star Wars, where although there's scientific principles involved, there's more fantasy than science fiction because it has to do with the all-powerful force or magic or something like that. Okay, and then there's children's fantasy, or animal fantasy, like Watership Down uses no magic at all, and it's basically about rabbits, and that's one of my favorite books, and I know a couple authors that's also their favorite book. So, um, Watership Down is a really good book as far as telling the world from an animal's point of view. Animal Farm is the same way, very good. Okay, and the elements of fantasy are as follows. In fantasy writing, there's always a goal or quest that needs to be completed before the story can resolve itself. So, like in the Lord of the Rings, it's to destroy the ring that Bilbo picked up in the first book. Okay, and that's the goal or the quest that needs to be done. In the first book of that, the quest was to get the gold from the dragon. Okay, and all these, and the characters as well go through transformations, and it's because of this you have to be careful how that you show that change in some action or deed the character performs. You must make extra careful that you show that change, that there's a change, okay, in the main character. I'm sorry, I have trouble reading my own writing sometimes. How I wrote that. Magic is common in fantasy, but not always. I mean, sometimes you have fantasy, like Alice in Wonder. Well, there's a bunch of fantasy stories, and not Alice in Wonderland. That's not a good example, but they do have other stories that are fantasy that have nothing to do with magic. Watership Down is one of them, and then there's others too. I just can't think of them offhand. And then what works for one character must work for another, unless there is an explanation why it doesn't. Okay, so like one character has magic and the other one has magic, and the other one loses his magic, you have to explain why that other one lost the magic, or etc. Okay, usually in fantasy there's a symbolism or spiritual forces at work. It could be God himself, or whatever the God may be. Though there is good and evil spirits. In the Lord of the Rings, there is no God per se, but Sauron could be interpreted like a devil-like character. The good is the forces of Gandalf, Galadriel, and others who help Frodo in his task to destroy the ring. I use Lord of the Rings a lot because I'm really into Lord of the Rings, so if you haven't guessed. But that was like one of my favorite and best fantasies when I was a kid. I mean, there are others. And a good example of, I just don't have them offhand. I should have probably did a better job at that. But using examples. I mean, there are like The Wizard of Oz is a good example of where there's magic, but it's not really magic. It's well, the witch has magic, but the wizard himself doesn't have any magic. It just appears that way. And but they do fight for good and evil as well. The witch is evil and the wizard is good. And the transformation is the journey, through the journey, and the hope that she may get back home, back to Kansas, okay? All right, and then there's world creation, which is the same as sci-fi, where you would have maps. And maps in fantasy are more often used than science fiction because usually you're confined to that one world and you have to get from point A to point B, and usually maps are heavily used in fantasy books. And The setting can be anytime, anywhere, just like science fiction. It could be a long time ago or it could be in the future. It all depends on how you want to arrange it. Okay? And of course, like science fiction, you also have to have the history of your world, the government, the language, the history of the characters, their backgrounds and stuff like that, and the historical account. And one thing that's important with fantasy is the historical count of the fantasy world. So you have to have a timeline. Even if you don't put it in the book, you need to keep a timeline of all the events in the book, and before the book and after the book. So, and in the world. In other words, what happened before our main character got involved and what happens afterwards. And this can be years before he was even born, folklore, anything that's connected to his character. Okay? I mean, I don't think you need to go as far as J.R. Tolkien did and did a whole encyclopedia, but that's up to you. I mean, my book does have like languages and maps and stuff like that. So, at the very least, you would have the maps and at least some of the languages if you're going to use that, or put asterisks on the bottom explaining, his footnotes explaining what language means. Okay. J.R. Tolkien was a linguist, so he basically was very good at languages. So, okay, and in the story, the scenery is very important to fantasy. You want to make sure your scenery is very vivid. Explain it in great detail, but don't go over the top. You only need to say things once about a thing, so you don't have to go on the whole chapter in different spots explaining how beautiful the place is. You can do that one paragraph, and that's all you need to do. You don't need to dwell on it. Okay, and story construction is the same as the other. It's basically you have an antagonist, you have a protagonist, you have a viewpoint character, a magic system if needed. In magic systems, you must follow the rules. Make sure you follow the rules in the magic systems. Don't make it like one minute certain magic works and then it doesn't, unless you have explanations for it, of course. And several characters in epic fantasies. Okay, so there's several characters. I had to figure out what I was writing there, but there's several characters in fantasy novels. Usually they can be up to the hundreds. It depends on how much detail you want to get into the characters and the actual things. Because a lot of times in fantasies, there's militias, there's like in my book, there's a navy. I mean, and there's always when you got a navy, you got at least 50 characters that are involved with a direct part of the book. So. And then usually in the story construction, it's usually, like I said, good versus evil. That's usually the way it is. Even in like Watership Down, they use the good rabbit and the bad rabbit. I mean, there's a bad rabbit who's out to shut the rest of them up and tell them who's boss and all that. And then there's Fiverr who's just innocent rabbit just trying to do what's right for the rest of his litter, or whatever you want to call it, the rest of his pack. I don't know what you call rabbits. I don't know if they're packs or swarms, whatever you want to call them. All right. But even if your characters, and this goes back to what I'm saying now, even if characters aren't human, you have to give them human qualities. So if they're aliens, you gotta still give them human qualities. Animals, give them human qualities. Whatever it is, Okay. And you should use all five of your senses to describe the scene. It smelled like burnt wood. It, I could hear the birds chirping in the distance. I saw the flash with my eyes. Um, I tasted the berries; they were bitter. All these things have to do with your senses, and it's important to expand on that. Okay, and like I said before, don't break your own rules of magic. That's another thing. Looks like I'm repeating myself here a little bit. And model your books after several authors you've read. So if you read a lot of fantasy books, you'll get kind of an idea how fantasy books work, and that I highly recommend doing that. Okay, and develop your characters and the world before you start the book. So develop your characters and your world before you start the book. So you want to make sure that you know where you're going with this. Draw your map for your story. Draw your history of the world, what you're going to put in your history. All that stuff should be done before you even start the book. Okay? Your research, basically. Okay? All right, and I got some final notes for you. Final thoughts. One is to know the audience you're writing for. And this is basically for all writing of all kinds. Make the science integral to your story, but not overwhelming. This is with science fiction. Make sure that you don't bore your reader with facts, and scientific facts through the whole book. Because then it gets to be more like a technical manual than a novel, right? Okay, and then you want to show your characters' motivations, show what motivates them, what gets them to do what they're doing in the story. And this could be like a guy, his wife is kidnapped, so he's motivated to get his wife back, something like that. Okay, and if you got a problem, introduce the problem early in the story so you grip the reader. You don't want to lose the reader, so you want to make sure that you present the problem early in the story and explain why he's needed. Okay, and create believable characters. And I know this sounds kind of weird when you're talking about aliens and you're talking about animals and stuff like that, but if you want, what I mean by believable is they have to be human-like in one way or another. I know in my original books, my original plan for my fantasy books was to make the animals actually animals, and I decided not to do that. I decided to explain how they got to be the way they are, and it was basically because of a spell that was put on them thousands of years ago, and that's why they're now no longer humans. They were humans at one point, but they changed into other animals when a spell was placed on the land. Okay, and that's how I explained away, made the believability of it as far as that goes. And with believable characters, you want to make sure, like, there was another guy in my book who was was originally a cat who talked. And I figured with my characters, I had enough animals in there that talked. So I actually made the cat a cat. I didn't give him speech, and I just left him as a cat. And he's still part of the story, but he's not as vocal as he would have been. Okay? All right. And I changed his name and made him human instead. Okay, and take us, if you're going to write a story, take us to a new time and place. Don't, this is why we write fantasy and sci-fi. to get us away from the real world. You know, the real world is bad enough. You know, we really need to get an escape, and I find fantasy one of the most pleasurable escapes that in my life. I mean, it's really, you know, it gets you away to another world and another place, and you decide problems, and makes you the creator of the world. Okay, and another thing you want to do is push your hero to the limit. You know, get him in the worst possible situation, and then figure out a way to get him out of it. You know, that's you know, you want readers to think all hope is lost, but then he finds a way out of it one way or another. An example of that is the James Bond series. He always manages to get out of whatever they put him in, and he always manages to do that. So that's basically what that's about. And then make sure you create a strong climax to your story. So make sure that, you know, in the end, you're going to really grip the readers and make them want to read it right to the end, you know, and see what happens at the end. So, well, that's all I have here tonight. It's been a pleasure to do this series for everybody, and I'm looking forward to doing some other things. Next week, I'm going to be doing reading, and I'll be doing a reading every week, and I'm going to do it for my first book, Dementia Lapse, and we'll start on chapter 1 next week, and I will read a chapter a week, and we'll go from there. And I'll, of course, it won't be named from pen to paper, but it will be, you know, just a reading with me every week. So, and I also have my special still going on this month, my 2 coloring books, and a box of crayons for $8. And that's it. You know, that's all it is, $8. And if you live in the Syracuse area, I'll even deliver it to you. Signed, sealed, and delivered. So, and you can get that at NicholasTDavisBooks.com if you want to do it. If you want it, you know, sent by mail. And you can join me on my YouTube channel, which is also Nicholas T. Davis Books, but with a capital N. And so next week, I'll be doing a reading, and I do have some shows coming up. Starting in March, I'll be at the Finger Lakes Con in Geneva at a waterfront hotel, and in April, I'll be doing the Heroes and Villains Con in Cortland, and in May, I'll be at the Conklin Con. So I'll be doing these 3 Comic Cons coming up, and I'll be also at the market in May at the City Market downtown, and it looks to be like a pretty busy season. So for shows, so hopefully I'll do better than last year. I'm hoping for it. We'll see. Okay, so next week we'll start with a reading, and we'll see you then. Bye, everybody. Have a good night.